people started organizing in Ottawa, Vancouver, Winnipeg, using our materials. And it was like, okay, so everyone was waiting for this. Like, people were looking for this and needed some support with mobilizing. And so it was a good lesson, and I think it's a lesson for our times right now. If you're waiting for somebody else to take the mantle and do the thing of calling out injustice, perhaps that person is you.
Welcome to Activists Make History. My name is Peggy Nash. I've been a union activist, a feminist advocate, and for nearly a decade, a member of Parliament in Canada's House of Commons. I know what it's like to start from scratch, against the odds, in building a community campaign or running for political office. Our lives are hugely affected by political decisions, but for the underrepresented in political life, Canadian politics can seem like a secret society designed to shut them out. I'm here with a special series from Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, to lift the curtain on these electoral mysteries and show the underdogs how we can do it. In Activists Make History, I talk to activists, experts, political leaders, and those like me who've been there and done that, to show you can make real progressive change in how Canadian democracy functions so that we can win a better world through elected office.
This episode was also made possible with the generous support of Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. So today on Activists Make History, we have the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto, the co-host of the podcast Sandy and Nora Talk Politics, a writer, public speaker, author, a person who's won a number of awards. We're glad you're taking the time to join us today. Welcome, Sandy Hudson.
Hi, Peggy. So nice to be here with you.
So I just finished reading your book, and I want to talk mostly about that. But let me just start by saying, there are so many terrible examples of Black and racialized people and Indigenous people killed at the hands of the police. What prompted you to jump in and take a leadership role with Black Lives Matter Toronto?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's one that I often address when I do workshops with youth who are trying to figure out how to have an impact on their world. Really, what happened back in 2014, there was a horrific police killing of a Black man in the United States, Michael Brown, in Ferguson, Missouri. And there was lots of coverage of it all over Canadian news media. But just before that had happened, there was another horrific killing of a Black man under strange circumstances, whose name was Jermaine Carby, in Brampton, in Canada. And there was nearly no coverage in news media about that. So in and around November of 2014, there was a call for solidarity actions around the world to support activists in Ferguson, Missouri, who were mobilizing to try to get justice for Michael Brown and his family. And I was looking to see, who was organizing the solidarity action in Toronto, and I could not find anyone. And I was also still feeling really frustrated that there hadn't been much coverage of the incident in which Jermaine Carby was killed by Peel police in Brampton. I remember I was messaging some friends. I had been involved in education activism. I was a student activist. I was working at the University of Toronto, and nobody knew of anybody who was doing a solidarity action. And I was lamenting to my brother about it. I was like, it's just so sad that it seems like nobody's going to do anything for this. And he was like, well, I'm kind of confused. You're an activist. You care about this. You have the skills to do it. You've done protests before. Why would you wait for somebody else to do it? Why wouldn't you just do it? And I was like, I have no good answer to that. That is
a very bluff.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I just feeling as though, maybe I wasn't the expert at the time, but I knew, I'd been doing work around race. My specialty academically was about race, and I was doing that in the context of education. And I was like, let me put my skills and knowledge to work here and contact as many people as possible to get something going. And it just seemed like, Peggy, so many other people were waiting for someone to do the thing, because by the time I got that admonishment from my brother, it was like we had 3 days to organize something. And that's not a lot of time. So we thought, maybe 50 people would come out. We contacted Jermaine Carby's family. We had like a good program to raise awareness about the issues that were happening in Canada, in addition to providing a solidarity action with folks in the States. But 3,000 people showed up. 3,000 people showed up. The event went viral on Facebook. People started organizing in Ottawa, Vancouver, Winnipeg, using our materials. And it was like, okay, so everyone was waiting for this. Like, people were looking for this and needed some support with mobilizing. And so it was a good lesson, and I think it's a lesson for our times right now. If you're waiting for somebody else to take the mantle and do the thing of calling out injustice, perhaps that person is you.
maybe you're the one that we're waiting for.
Exactly.
And, I just think when activists do take that leadership role, it's not that they are kind of the most unique person in the world, although you are very unique, but you're someone who just steps up and you offer the opportunity to all those people to get involved. They were all waiting and you gave them that opportunity, which is pretty special.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that over the period between, let's say, 2014 or 2013 really to today, I think we see that people getting involved in work around anti-racism inspires other work around anti-racism. On the climate crisis, inspires other work around the climate crisis. On Indigenous rights and justice, inspires other work. Like, we've seen, like, there was this groundswell in the last 10 years. I mean, we're in this huge backlash period right now, clearly, but that is, I think, a testament to all of the work that has been done in the last decade. And that can't be done by like one organization or one person. We all inspire and support one another when we do that work. And I think it's certainly time for renewal of that.
Yeah, if movements weren't effective, they wouldn't need a backlash, right?
That's
if they're
right.
ineffective, nobody would care.
Exactly.
But I do want to move on to your book, because your book really carries on that work about the role of the police. And I remember at the time with Black Lives Matter, there was the call to defund the police. And I really struggled with that. But of course, I'm a white woman. If I need help, who would I call? I'd call the police. If you're Black or Indigenous, you might not want to call the police. They may be the last people you'd want to call. But the title of your book is Defund Black Lives, Policing, and Safety for All. And, I have to say, I started this book a bit skeptically. Like, I wasn't sure it was going to resonate with me. But it hooked me in right away, and I have to say I blasted through it very quickly. I would urge people to read it. You talk early on about propaganda, about how the police have been treated with kid gloves, but promoted through popular culture, through journalism, so that we are conditioned to see police in a certain light. And yet then you describe so many examples where the police end up causing more harm rather than preventing it. And especially for racialized people, Black people, workers on picket lines. I've certainly been on picket lines where police were not our friends. So anybody with less power. And it really hit home when you talked about, well, they try to explain it away with a few bad apples. These are the exceptions. But you described so many examples of this, and tracing right back to the role of police. Why were they created? Maybe can you talk a bit about that and how crime gets defined, what the police are for, how they developed, and what is crime in our society?
Yeah, so many big questions. I mean, gosh, I think the part of the book where I describe why police are, what they are for, why they were created, was the part of the book that was the most revealing to research for me personally, because there were some things that surprised me as well. I mean, I thought I knew, but there were some things that surprised me as well. And one of the things that surprised me the most was just how long lasting this cycle of horrific experience of police violence happens. The public gets really frustrated. There's a number of actions and a flurry of political activity to try to reduce the power of the police. And then there's some sort of study that's announced, maybe a couple new policies, and then everybody forgets. And then we go back into the cycle until the next horrific example manages to break through to the mainstream. I was shocked to find out that that has been the case since the very beginning of policing. And so I trace modern policing to the late 1700s. The reason why I start there is because it's the first time you get a uniformed police force, a paid police force that replaces a sort of community model where people would have what they called night watches, where everybody in the community was expected to volunteer to do a night watch to keep the community safe. In the United Kingdom, they established something different. It was, this uniformed force. Part of the reason they were doing that was because the army was overseas dealing with the American Revolution, and they really thought that they needed a way to keep the Irish in check, their first colony. And so they started paying these police officers. They hired a police force. It was kind of thought of like a almost army force to keep the Irish in check. And they found that this worked really well. They armed them. They gave them tools of tortures. They gave them these areas where they could detain people and torture them to get them in line. And through this process, they were able to control the land, control religion, control expression, and to control where people went. So that was, and they were like, oh, this is really great. And they decided to export that model to their other colonies around the world, in the Caribbean, in the southern United States, and of course, anywhere where there were an enslaved population or an indigenous population that needed to be controlled. The other thing that was really important during this time is that they were moving to a more standard wage system of paying people for their work, and where previously it would be customary if you were, for example, involved in trade and you were like working on the ships and you were one of those workers, it'd be customary for you to, you're dealing with the coffee beans, to take some of that coffee for yourself. If you're dealing with salt, to take some of that salt for yourself, because you were the person who was putting it together. You were like, it made sense that, like, I'm doing this thing for the merchant who owns all the stuff, but I get to keep a little bit. And in London, they created all of these new laws that punished people for taking, because they wanted people to just get a wage. That's a huge shift. It's a very big shift in how people were expected to, like, what is this? Like, I want the stuff that I'm working with. That's what's valuable. In order to control people, they needed police to say, you can't take these things that you've been working with or for. You have to instead take the wage. And previously, it had been the responsibility of the merchants themselves, the business owners, to take care of their own stuff. But the business owners really convinced the government to take responsibility from this with a moral argument. And that was again exported around the world because there was a lot of trade and shipping going on. And it became a way to control workers. So you have colonization, control of the land, you have enslavement, control of an enslaved population, and then labor, control of workers, all to benefit the government's interests, the king's interests, and the business owners' interests. And from the very beginning, when London decides, okay, we're going to expand this to our city, to our capital city, to London, people are like, this is terrible. The police are brutal. They cost way too much money. They're taking way too much of our taxes. They attack us for no reason. There's so much brutality. Some of these crimes don't make sense. Why wouldn't I be able to take some of the stuff that I'm working? This is ridiculous. And within 2 years of establishing a London police force, there's a call for its abolition. And the government decides to do a study. They do a study and they decide that they need some more police oversight and implement some policies like that, and they move on. It's really quite remarkable. The other thing that it was created to do, the final reason, is to control morality. And we see that in laws that police people's sexuality, for example, or
I'm old enough to remember the bathhouse raids in Toronto, just as one example. Horrible, horrible. And to think this is our public dollars. We're paying for this as a public, and and there's many examples you raise in your book.
Yeah, and as for all of those things that I talked about, none of it has anything to do with safety. All of it has to do with control. And the idea of linking policing and safety was a very specific and strategic campaign of the police in the 1930s and 40s.
Can you talk a bit about the propaganda? Because that really struck me, because you go back to these old cop shows in the 1950s. And yeah, I mean, anybody who watches a murder mystery or how many shows, Law and Order, and the role of the media. Can you talk a bit about this interaction between kind of public communication and the image of the police and this notion about their serving and protecting?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting how that all came together, because it really required a number of different things to be implemented in order to create this image of police as serving and protecting. Because if you look at policing media, or the media that depicted the police prior to like the 1940s, the police were typically depicted as like a bumbling, kind of embarrassing group of people. And I mean, some of that still survives in our media. You know, if you've ever seen like those Saturday morning cartoons, I remember when I was young, of like, you know, you'd see a police officer eating a donut and maybe, you know, making some errors, you know, a bumbling police officer. That was the image of police prior to like the 1930s. But what happens in the 1930s is that the International Policing Association that still exists today is like, you know, this is really bad. People around the world hate us and think we're a nuisance and think that we are corrupt, which they were. You know, there were all sorts of reports that have been coming up about their corruption and involvement in like illicit activities. And so they're desperate to change this perception so that they can have more power and legitimacy on the streets. And in the United States, which of course dominates English-speaking media around the world, the government implements what's called the Hays Code. And the Hays Code provided a morality standard for what could be shown on television, in public media, on movies. And one of the rules in the Hays Code that really shifted how police were depicted was that there was a standard for how police had to be seen as the good guys. You could not depict crime as something being like someone breaking the law as something being good. You know, people had to come to justice. There was a law that basically told Hollywood, you have to create moral entertainment. And so that really shifted how police were able to be depicted on screen. And then in addition to that, there were early shows like Dragnet really collaborated with police to say, you know, like, if you give us ideas for stories, we'll give you like the greatest sort of depiction and treatment in television. And this relationship was so close that the police were able to approve and disapprove of different storylines in some of these really early police procedurals. And then on top of that, former FBI director J. Edgar Hoover was like, you know, he's infamous for the ways that he tried to...
J. Edgar Hoover.
The notorious J. Edgar Hoover, who was all kinds of bad, from McCarthyism to anti-Black racism. He also was like, I would like to collaborate with the police and with Hollywood to try to make sure that police are seen in a really good light. And so all of these things coming together creates one of the most popular forms of entertainment we have today, the police procedural, in which the police are all of a sudden constructed as a heroic force. Here is the hero. And you're seeing that every night. You're hearing it on the radio every night that the police are the heroes. And very importantly, with shows like Dragnet, one of these really early shows, and that continues up until today with shows like Law and Order, where these ideas at the beginning of the show, they would be like, this show is pulled directly from real life. And people believe that. People really believe that, even though nothing could be further from the truth.
Now, you also talk about the symbiotic relationship between the media, not just popular culture, but journalists and the police, and how the people trying to get news end up almost being dependent on the police. And there's this scratching of each other's backs, which also benefits the police.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the police are known to ice out journalists who are critical of them, who publish stories that are questioning of police activities. And this is something I think here in Canada, people need to understand is a really big problem in Canada. I remember very early on in my activism around this area, talking to journalists who were like, we can't get any information from the police. We try, even when it comes to laws that have been put in place that we think would allow us to get information, like freedom of information requests. Police routinely deny responding to those or redact information to the detriment of the public receiving the information it needs in order to really evaluate whether the police are doing the job that we want them to do or not. And this is a bigger issue in Canada than it is in the United States, where there's a lot more laws on the books as to what citizens are entitled to have access to. And so what happens in that situation? If a journalist wants to report on crime and one of the only sources that they have, well, I argue in the book that it's not one of the only sources that they have, but in a post-Twitter world where you're trying to get the news out as quickly as possible, and maybe you can't go to all the different sources you may want to for crime because you're trying to get out to a deadline. One of the easiest places is the police because they will have some sort of report. And so that means you're like almost wholly dependent on them in order to write up the first story of what's going to come out on any issue. And I mean, that's why we see, when George Floyd was murdered, the first stories were like something like a man has like a terrible medical experience during an arrest and dies. Like that, those were what the first stories said. They had nothing to do with, he was killed by a police officer, like he was murdered.
Thank goodness for bystander video, or it may never have come out.
Exactly. And so this relationship where the journalist is wholly dependent on the police means they have to be very careful, because if they need to go back to the police for more information, they need to try to not make those police officers upset, because the police get to say whatever they want about any situation. They're not an objective truth teller, but they are often treated as though they are, where, we could be talking to witnesses, we can be talking to hospitals, we could be talking to all sorts of different resources, but by and large, we focus on the police, which gives them a lot of latitude to really shape a story and what a story looks like. The other thing too is now in this world, this post-Twitter world, where the news is like entertainment more than it is what you need to know in order to, as a citizen, make good decisions about how you're going to engage in civic life, what decisions you're going to make at the ballot box. It's more about like, what's the most sauciest thing we could show you in the first 10 minutes of a news program, or like what's going to get more clicks when you hit a website. And the oddest, most salacious crime stories that are unlikely to affect you and unlikely to be part of like a system of errors or a systemic problem is what gets focused on. And the solution for those things are often Okay, cops. Okay. So the police say, and the police are going to do this. Whereas, it might be more important for us to know about how our continued engagement in oil production is really killing us. That's not as salacious as what happened to the Shermans, like it's not.
And yet, even with the Shermans, Kevin Donovan has had to go to court repeatedly to try to get information because the police refused to provide it. But you make the point about the essentially crime and punishment stories that are all over the media, and no context, no analysis, and the solution is always the police. And you also make the point that especially around budget time, you see big busts of guns, drugs, whatever, big crime busts. It feels manipulative at the time, but it clearly does have an impact on the way the public sees the police.
And it's meant to. These are campaigns to try to get more money and more power into the police. And it's just so strange to me that it was, I feel like it was more controversial a few years ago, but it remains controversial to critique the police. I mean, gosh, it's a public service like any other. Like, it should be more sacrosanct, controversial to critique teachers. But people will critique teachers all the way up and down and take as much money from them as possible and be like, oh, education sucks, so let's take more cuts to education, blah, blah,
Welcome
blah.
to Ontario. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But the police, you hear of these huge blunders or these schemes that the police are involved in, whether it's like a drug scheme that was revealed a few years ago, or sexual assaults, or there was a story just a couple months ago from Toronto where some teenagers were stopped for like a license plate issue, and a 16-year-old ended up getting killed by the police. How do you get stopped for a license plate issue and end up dead? It just doesn't make any sense as a kid, And
you had a story about a woman
critique-
who couldn't pay her transit fare, or she didn't pay her. She didn't think she needed to pay her transit fare, and ended up getting roughed up, handcuffed, thrown in jail, and owed this huge amount of money for a transit fare.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing, that the argument for defunding the police is like, really, I mean, it boils down to, we're spending all of this money on what? On what? When we could be spending it on something else. That example of a person getting roughed up. So the story in the book, it's New Year's, and on many transit systems on New Year's, you don't pay. Like there's an expectation that you don't pay. So this person, I think the story is from the Bay Area, the San Francisco area, that is using the BART transit system, Bay Area Regional Transit, and assumes that it's free, but it's not. Okay, so she goes through and doesn't pay, and she's going to work. The police officers, who cost how much? I don't know. There's like 3 of them who come up to her and is like, ma'am, you didn't pay. And she's like, oh, I didn't realize. I'll just go pay. It's like $3 and something. And they're like, that's not how it works. Put your hands behind your back. And she's like, what? Just let me pay. I didn't realize that you had to pay on New Year's. And they attack her and they rough her up. And I mean, there's 3 police officers. She's screaming and crying. All of these people on the transit system are like, what is going on over all of this? You have to think to yourself, then she gets detained, and then she takes them to court, and then the city is defending itself in court. Like, how much money and resources are put into making sure that this one person pays this fare that she offered to pay at the time? If you're going to do all that, you might as well just make transit free and eliminate the crime.
I thought that was a really good point you made. And, I think the argument that hit home with me, I still think if I'm getting beat up or attacked or robbed, I'm still going to want to call the police. But 2 other points you made that really hit home with me. One was the actually very tiny amount of cases that the police actually solve. Like, who are you going to call if your house is broken into? The insurance company.
Yes.
But the other thing I think that really made me shift my perspective was, right now we're defunding social programs, we're defunding education, we're defunding transit, so many things are
Housing,
defunded.
look at housing.
Housing, mental health, and pouring every year more money into the police. So you compare defunding the services that we need, and why not defund the police and put some of those resources into actually solving problems? So that really hit home with me, because it's a hell of a lot of money, and there are alternatives to just giving everybody a taser or body armor or helicopters or drones or whatever. I mean, nobody wants to think that we're in a community without rules that can be enforced. But just tell me a bit about that balance between social programs and law enforcement, or the budgets of the police.
Yeah, I wasn't born an abolitionist. I came to this myself too. And one of the things that really opened my eyes, like, just think about it. In any situation where you call the police, very likely they're showing up after the fact, after whatever threat is happening is already gone. Now, that's not always the case, but most of the time it's the case, right? It's a reactive service. And the idea that we could instead do whatever we can to prevent violence and harm from happening, rather than pouring all of this money into the reaction to violence and harm, is just like, that's what this idea is about. And how do you prevent violence and harm? Well, people take actions that are violent, that are risky, where they're trying to take power back for all sorts of reasons. And one of those reasons is when they're feeling stretched, when they feel like they have no other choice. And in the society that we live in today, people are taking risks in part because the ability to afford to live is so difficult. And so if somebody feels as though they can't make it in the legitimate economy, they might engage in a survival economy, an under the table economy, a drug economy, to try to make ends meet. I mean, that's the system that we live in. And so if we make it so that there are less risks that have to be taken in order to function as a human being, we expect people to work, and they have to get to work. Okay. You have to get to work. Is everybody within walking distance of where they work in these days? No, they're not. So now we're telling people we expect you to get to work. Well, you actually need money to get to work. Well, why don't we provide a social program? Like, instead of spending so much money on police, we put in a way for people to get to where they need to get for free, so that they can work, so they can get there. I mean, that's the transit system idea of, like, making that free. Another example of this came up a lot during the election, actually. We were hearing about femicide being a huge issue in Canada, of which it is. And Mark Carney, one of his promises was that he was going to deal with femicide. It was like, okay, great. How are we going to do this? And the promise was to create a new category of murder and to hire more police officers.
Sounds like it might not save lives.
I don't think so. It's not, we're not having police interject at the moment that a woman is about to be killed, most likely in her home, most likely by an intimate partner. That's not, so why would we hire more police? A category of murder is something that happens after the fact. So what do we need in that circumstance? Well, women need to be able to have choices. People who are experiencing domestic violence need to be able to have choices. The choice to leave and still be able to afford their lives. The choice to leave and still be able to take care of children if that's something that they need to do. The choice to leave and have somewhere to go. Our shelter system is stretched completely thin. There's not enough shelters. And we live in a system in which we have not fixed a gender wage gap, in which we can ensure that the people who are most vulnerable to gender-based violence have the ability to escape and live on their own. What is giving more money to police going to do? Nothing. But if we solve the problem through the programs of, like, providing shelters and making sure that we close the gender wage gap and so on, then we reduce the probability of this being an issue, femicide. Like, that's how you do it. It's harder to explain. it's harder to discuss. It's not great for Twitter, but it's the thing that we know works. I mean, there's tons of research, but somehow as a society, we continue to accept this, like, we're going to put more money into policing to be tough on this kind of crime. Well, it doesn't work. It's been hundreds of years of this. We know it doesn't work. Can we move on from this?
So, I mean, the latest debate here in Ontario, and you may be aware of this, is once again putting cops in schools.
Outrageous.
Now, at the same time, they are, we have a massive multi-billion-dollar backlog in the maintenance of schools, repairs and maintenance of schools. They're cutting music classes, closing pools. There are mental health challenges. We don't have enough counselors. There aren't enough assessments. Class sizes are too big, and that undermines the ability of our skilled teachers to be able to do the work that they need to do. So that, to me, is one of the clearest examples. And you give an example in your book where an A student, a 17-year-old, said that if there were going to be cops in the school, he was not going to continue at that school because that just was a threat to his safety. So I guess the other question I just want to ask you is
Let me
sorry, go ahead.
I mean, Peggy, did you go to public school?
Yes.
And were there cops in your classrooms?
Well, we had Elmer the safety elephant, and I think someone came in to talk to us about road safety, but no, we had no security checks, no scans, there was no buzzing people in. People just wandered in, but we had.
Was there a school nurse?
Yes, there was a nurse.
Was there a full-time librarian?
Yes.
And there were counselors? Yes. Yeah. Right. And how many people were in your class? Do you remember, like, when you were young, how many?
Sandy, listen, it was a long time ago. I don't remember it being so big that I could hide if I hadn't done my homework.
Right. And, even myself, there were 14 kids in my class growing up all the time, 14, because I was in a program. So there was only 14 of us. We had great attention from the teachers. There was a school nurse. There was a full-time librarian. There were counselors. There were all these folks. Was there fights on the school ground? Yeah, every once in a while kids got into fights, but there were teachers everywhere. There were adults everywhere. We had like a full-time music teacher. We had all of this, the coaches for sports. There was all of these great people around. Today, there are barely any full-time librarians in schools. They have them part-time, number one, so you can access the library at specific times. Like, school nurses have started to disappear. School counselors, there are fewer and fewer of them. And class sizes are huge for teachers to manage. And we're totally fine when it's like we're cutting funding to education. You know what keeps kids safe? Having responsible adults around to help them navigate the choices that they are making in their lives, because that's what it is to be a kid, to help them navigate play, to help them navigate education and learning. But if you've got someone stationed treating you like a criminal with a gun, questioning you in the hallways, with the ability to arrest you, I promise you that is not an environment that's conducive to learning.
It breeds hostility, I'm sure. Let me ask you, I mean, all of these arguments were really persuasive with me. You say you are an abolitionist, so you don't believe there is any role ever for police. Is that your view, or am I oversimplifying it?
Where I start from is like, please show me what the police are doing well. And I am willing to rethink the idea that they should be involved. And there's nothing at this point. Now, I talk about in the book, when it comes to serious violent circumstances, that we do need something to deal with that. But it's not what we have right now, because they are not effectively dealing with those situations because of the training and all of the systemic errors that are inherent to policing. And so I do think that there's something we might need to construct, but I believe that we are better than trying to continually shape this square peg of a form of social control, of colonization, of control of enslaved people, of control of workers into the round hole of safety. It's not going to work. It hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. And we keep deluding ourselves into thinking that it will.
It's so interesting. I mean, I could talk to you about this for much longer, but I have 2 or 3 other questions I just want to get to. And I just want to say to people, read the book, because there's so much more in there that we're not going to be able to get to in this conversation. But it's not, I don't know, I think very often we read things and we know in advance we're already going to agree with them. And so it's not that often you read something that really makes you look at the world in a different way. Anyway. I highly recommend it. But you are living in LA, and are you still going to law school, or have you finished?
I finished.
You finished, yay! Okay, so I want to ask you what you're going to do next, but I want to get your take on what the hell is happening in Los Angeles and the whole Trump era in the U.S. What is it like as a Black woman living in LA today, and like what's going to happen?
I mean, wow. When the immigration raid started, I was actually in St. John's, Newfoundland. The Sandy and Nora podcast did a live show out there. And so I was in St. John's, Newfoundland, and then I went to Banff. And so I wasn't home, but I'm involved. I have like all of these, you got your group chats with your friends. So I'm in all these group chats, and people were sharing like, okay, tell the people that you know to avoid these areas at this time, because I've heard that the ICE officers are coming, and that kind of thing is continuing daily and is terrifying. There really is this fear right now. And, like I'm an immigrant, to the United States, and I know a number of people who are immigrants, and people who are in the migrant community to people who are citizens who don't appear white are terrified, especially if they appear Latinx, because the United States, this enforcement, they are picking up citizens at times and detaining them because they're not going through a due process procedure to make sure that the people that they are detaining are even being detained for what they're saying they should be detained for. I won't say lawfully, because I don't think that any of this is lawful given my own education, but they're not even doing it for the express purpose that they're saying. It's really terrifying. Now, it's weird to see the coverage, especially the like right-wing coverage. It makes it seem like the entire city is on fire. For people who don't know Los Angeles or who's not been to Los Angeles, it's a very, very sprawling city. It's huge. It's huge. And it's not like a traditional city where there's like a downtown where everybody hangs out and there's a really tight concentration of people, and then there's suburbs. It really actually is more like 7 or 8 suburbs that are kind of stuck together. And there is something that's called a downtown that not many people spend time at. More people are going to the beach. That's more like how LA functions. And it's not a walkable city either. It's a city in which you really do require a car. It's terrible. I hate this about it. So the area where the protests had really started was a very small area of downtown. But the way that it was being covered made it seem like it was happening everywhere, which wasn't the case. But regardless of that, what the police were doing, sending in the National Guard. I mean, I saw a video of police running over protesters with their vehicles. What is going on? Now, what I will say, though, in terms of the size of protests, the No Kings protest that happened just this past weekend from when we are talking, in which the day that was Trump's birthday and the
military parade, and
created a military parade in the style of dictators, and there were over 2,000 activations all over the United States. Now that day, I mean, I had just come in the day before from Banff and I was moving, so I couldn't go to the protest, but I was like in my car trying to get all of this stuff for my move. And I think I passed like 3 or 4 different protests, which for Los Angeles, again, is very weird because it's like this very suburban place. And so to pass that many protests means that it's a huge activation. All of this is to say, I think people are really rising up, are really frustrated. There is a groundswell of opposition against what the Trump administration is doing. And it really is terrifying. It really is terrifying to get those messages every morning. Like today, I have messages of like what places people need to tell their friends to stay away from, where people need support, what kind of support that they're looking for, food and so on, for people who feel like they can't go to work. Like it's really is a very terrifying thing to watch.
It almost feels like you can sense the fragility of U.S. democracy, and it's quite frightening.
I mean, that's really what's happening. I mean,
Yeah.
Democracy only works if we're all committed to it. And I think it's really clear that some people are not.
And people aren't. And, you, after decades of neoliberalism and growing inequality, it makes some parts of the population so vulnerable to that strongman message. That's also frightening. But that is a whole other podcast, and we are not going to do that.
It really is.
But listen, I two smaller last questions. One is, what are you going to do with that big law degree? What are your plans? Are you permanently in LA, or what's the story?
I'm in LA while I work on some projects. So I don't think I'll be here permanently. I don't know if I disparaged the non-walkability of this city enough. It is really terrifying. I hate it. It's not great. But the sun and the beach are really conducive to creative projects. And so I think that's really important for me. I'm working on another book right now, and it's easier to work on that stuff here, I find, partially because I don't know as many people. And so I'm not always distracted and pulled in other directions. And in terms of the law degree, I am using that in my writing. I haven't decided yet whether or not I want to practice. I did do some work with the ACLU and with the Public Defender's Office as part of my work. And I think the thing about the law is that it is very individual. You're working on individual cases. And to me, I think my best contribution is in systemic argument, like policy-based argument. And so I may take the bar, who knows? I haven't decided yet, but I think my best contribution is in these sort of polemic arguments that I'm making in books like Defund. And so I'm going to continue with that for now, and we'll see. We'll see where I go next.
We can't wait to see. And I was going to ask, how can people reach you? But it sounds like you're writing a book. You probably don't want to be reached in a super heavy way. You do have a website, so Sandy Hudson, you can find her website. And so Sandy Hudson's latest book, Defund: Black Lives, Policing, and Safety. It is a terrific read, a lot of great history and research. Well done. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Peggy. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
Activists Make History is a special podcast series from Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, a publication and production of the Broadbent Institute. This show could not have been made possible without the generous contribution of Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. If you'd like to hear more from Activists Make History, share and subscribe to Perspectives Journal on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. Once again, I'm Peggy Nash, your host for Activists Make History and proud member of the Broadbent Institute's Board of Directors. You can read my latest book, Women Winning Office, an activist guide to getting elected, from Between the Lines Books.